2nd, 2016. So we start with the homage to the Buddha 3 times. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Okay, good morning, everybody. Okay, so I have to relearn how to give a class since it's been 3 months and I've fallen out of the routine. I'll stand so people can see me in the back. Okay, so today we will be continuing. Now we're sort of coming into the final stretch with the middle-length discourses. We started this back in, could have been late 2009, early 2010. So now it's about 6 years that we've been going through. So there are still enough suttas to keep us engaged. April, May, probably through June. And so today we come to a sutta. It's called the Nandakovāda Sutta. Nandaka-ovāda Sutta. So this is a discourse called Ovāda means instruction, and the monk who gives the instruction is named Nandaka, Venerable Nandaka. And Venerable Nandaka was designated by the Buddha. The Buddha designated numbers of monks, nuns, lay men and lay women who excelled in particular areas. So for example, Sariputta was the monk disciple who was foremost in Panya, wisdom. Moggallana, the foremost in psychic powers. Mahakasyapa, the foremost in the ascetic practices, and Venerable Nandaka was designated the monk who was foremost in giving instructions to bhikkhunis. Even though there's only one sutta in the whole Sutta Pitaka which exemplifies his instruction to bhikkhunis, and this is the sutta. Okay, so it starts off when the Buddha was living at Savatthi, at the Jetavana monastery. Okay, and then Mahapajapati Gautami comes together with 500 bhikkhunis in order to see the Buddha, the Blessed One. And I think everybody knows who Mahapajapati Gautami is. She was the Buddha's foster mother, and because King Suddhodana was married both to the Buddha's mother, Mahamaya, and Mahapajapati Gautami, so she was at once his foster mother because his mother passed away shortly after his birth, and she was also his aunt. And then after the King Suddhodana passed away, then Mahapajapati, together with 500 of the Sakyan women, requested to become bhikkhunis. And so they became the first Buddhist nuns, and Gautami became like the head or leader of this group of nuns, the spokeswoman, spokesnun for the other nuns. And so she comes to the Buddha and she asks the Buddha to advise, or this really means to instruct the bhikkhunis, to give a teaching to the bhikkhunis, to give a Dhamma talk to the bhikkhunis. And now it was a practice that the Buddha had established for the Sangha that, you see, because the Buddha would be living close to the monks, and so the Buddha would give, very often he would be giving discourses which the monks would get to hear, but the bhikkhunis would be living at another location, wouldn't get to hear. So in order for the instruction to pass on to the bhikkhunis, he would request a bhikkhu to go at regular intervals to the bhikkhuni quarters in order to give instructions to the bhikkhunis. In fact, this became a regular procedure within the monastic regulations that every 2 weeks, that is on the Uposatha, the day of the religious observance, a monk would have to go to the bhikkhuni quarters in order to give a discourse to the bhikkhunis. Okay, so this is the background to the sutta, where the text says that on that occasion the elder bhikkhus were taking turns in advising or instructing the bhikkhunis, but the Venerable Nandaka did not want to advise them or to instruct them when his turn came. I think the commentary says that whenever Nandaka's turn came, he would find some excuse, like he would go to, to visit another village some distance away, or he would get involved in some activity like sewing robes. So when they would come and say, it's your turn to instruct the bhikkhunis, either he's not there or, oh, I'm too busy, can't do it. And then the commentary gives an explanation, so the question comes, why does Nandaka always try to escape this obligation, his responsibility of instructing the bhikkhunis? The text doesn't give an explanation, the canonical text, but the commentary gives an explanation. And as I often say when it comes to commentaries, you have to remember that this is something coming down in the narrative tradition. So often we have to take what the commentary says with a grain of salt. It could be like preachers wanting to make the text more interesting, and so they throw in a little legendary story, and then it becomes part of the commentary. So what the commentary says is that in a previous life, Nandaka had been a king, and these 500 bhikkhunis had been his harem. And so maybe over several lifetimes, he had been a king, a prince, and the women who became the bhikkhunis had been the members of his harem. And he was afraid that there would be some monk who has the ability to see into past lives, and they would see Nandaka surrounded by the 500 bhikkhunis, and they would think, why is this happening? Back in that past life, he was the king surrounded by the 500 women of the court, and so they can't break their ties to one another. They're sort of bound to each other by these ties of affection. And so for that reason, he tried to escape this regular obligation of instructing the bhikkhunis. Okay, but now the Buddha inquires into this and says, whose turn is it today to instruct the bhikkhunis? And Ananda says that it's Nandaka's turn, but he doesn't want to instruct them. Okay, so then the Buddha addresses Nandaka and tells him to instruct the bhikkhunis. And then Venerable Nandaka, because now he's getting the command coming from the command center, from the Buddha himself, so he has to accept the Buddha's injunction. Okay, so Venerable Nandaka goes over to the bhikkhunis' quarters, and when the bhikkhunis see him coming, then they prepare the seat for him, set up water and so on, and then he sits down. And so now he says that he's going to instruct them in the form of, this would be like a question and answer format. So he's saying that he's going to present them with the teaching, and then ask them if they understand. If they understand, they should say yes. If they do not understand, they should say they do not understand. And then if they have any questions, they should ask their questions. Okay, so now Venerable Nandaka begins the instruction, and this is a topic which we've covered several times already, so it's not a new presentation. But we'll say that Venerable Nandaka introduces some quite interesting similes, which I think are unique to the sutta. Okay, so he begins by saying, with the questionnaire, asking them, presenting the teaching, as the Buddha often does, by asking them questions and then drawing out the reply. So he says, what do you think is the eye, and goes through the other senses, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind, permanent or impermanent? And so they say they're impermanent. Then is what is impermanent, here it's translated suffering or happiness, which is not really satisfactory, but there's no really satisfactory way to translate this precisely. The Pali is yad anicchang dukkhaṃ va sukhaṃ va. So whatever is impermanent, is it dukkha or sukha? So we could say dukkha, not so much suffering, but unsatisfactory, inadequate, deficient, incapable of providing solid, secure, lasting happiness. That would be a kind of capsule definition of dukkha. So suffering is one aspect, but a broader meaning of dukkha is that which is incapable of providing genuine, lasting satisfaction and security. And then the opposite of this is more than just happiness, but it would be lasting, substantial, genuine, secure happiness, happiness which is invulnerable to change and to transformation. Okay, so then the nuns say, since they already are quite well acquainted with the Dhamma, so they say that it's dukkha. So the 6 sense faculties are dukkha, they're unsatisfactory. And then Nandaka asks, what is impermanent, suffering, or dukkha, and subject to change? Is it fit to regard this thus? This is mine, this I am, this is myself. And so they respond, no, Bhante. And so here, in this just brief questionnaire, Nandaka has covered what are called the 3 universal characteristics. So we go from impermanent. What is impermanent is flawed, defective, unsatisfactory. And what is unsatisfactory, what is impermanent and unsatisfactory, cannot be regarded as myself. Okay, so Nandaka goes through all of the 6 internal sense bases or sense faculties using the same procedure, the same question and answer format. Okay, so then Nandaka approves of their answer. He says, good, good sisters, so it is with a noble disciple who sees this as it actually is with correct, accurate, or proper wisdom. You know, it strikes me when I read this passage that there's a certain difference between the what I would call the classical Buddhist position and the kind of idea that has spread out in what's now sometimes called the modern mindfulness movement. The idea in the modern mindfulness movement is, yes, everything's impermanent, but you stay in the present moment and you enjoy the present moment. You know, so that when you just are mindful with what is occurring in the present, then everything is wonderful and beautiful and splendid and magnificent. And so you just sort of ride the waves, the changing waves of life, enjoying the present moment. And that is, well, the practice of mindfulness. You know, usually it's sort of disconnected with from its origins in Buddhism. And so now I was just reading a book I'm still reading it, by an American scholar. His name is Jeff Wilson. It's called Mindful America. And he traces the stages by which mindfulness originated in a kind of modernistic presentation of Buddhism to make Buddhism more appealing to, modern educated Westerners. And then gradually sort of the Buddhism aspect gets pushed over to the side and the mindfulness gets separated off until now we have mindful cooking, mindful parenting, mindful sex, mindful business entrepreneurship, mindful mindful momming, being a mother, mindfulness and the single woman. Oh yeah, there was a book years ago, Sex and the Single Woman, was that it? Yeah, now it's mindfulness and the single woman. There was a TV series, Sex and the City. I haven't seen or heard of a book yet called Mindfulness and the City. But anyway, the idea in the sort of modern mindfulness movement is that just being aware of the present moment is sufficient in itself, and that's the cause of joy and exuberance and bliss. Of course, when you're able to keep your mind in the present, then you experience kind of happiness, freedom, joy. Certainly that is the case. But the point of the Buddha's teaching is not just to to be mindful of the present moment, but to see that the constant change of every event occurring in the present is a kind of revelation of the intrinsic unsatisfactoriness of everything that arises through causes and conditions. And then the insight into the unsatisfactoriness of everything that arises, the impermanence and unsatisfactoriness, is for breaking the identification with it. That is, for seeing into the non-self nature of everything conditioned. So now the mindfulness movement, sort of like one of the sub-themes is through mindfulness one discovers one's true self. One could, instead of getting weighed down by all of the streams of thought and false sense of identities that are imposed upon one by society, the expectations of others, by being constantly mindful of whatever one is experiencing, one discovers one's true self. But for the Buddha's approach, or what the aim that the Buddha's teaching is pointing to, is that through attention to the present, observing the impermanence and unsatisfactory nature of everything that arises, one thereby generates the insight that this is not mine, this is not I, this is not myself. Okay, so first, Nandaka develops this question and answer format in regard to the 6 internal sense bases, that is the 6 sense faculties, the 6 instruments of perception. Then we come to the 6 sense objects, that is, he develops the same basic argument regarding forms, sounds, odors, flavors, tactile objects, and mind objects. So they're all impermanent. Because they're all impermanent, they're all dukkha, unsatisfactory. And because they're impermanent, unsatisfactory, subject to change, they are not fit to be taken as mine, I, myself. And the reason is that the nuns say is because we have already seen this well as it actually is with proper wisdom, that the 6 external bases are impermanent. And I think from the standpoint of this discourse, it's significant that the nuns here are saying that they've already seen this well with correct wisdom, with proper wisdom. So from this we could see that they're not beginners in the Dhamma, but they've already developed insight, wisdom. It's not clear what status of attainment they've reached, what level of attainment they've reached so far. But from this we could see that they've already developed strong and clear wisdom of insight. Okay, so we have 6 internal sense bases, 6 external sense bases, and then in the next section of the discourse, the same format is applied to the 6 types of consciousness. That is, I consciousness through mind consciousness. And again, they say that the reason that they recognize this is not mine, not I, not myself, because we have already seen this well as it actually is with proper wisdom, that the 6 classes of consciousness are impermanent. Okay, so now we have, in effect, these are the 18 elements, 6 sense faculties or internal sense bases, 6 external sense bases, 6 types of consciousness. So these are the 18 dhatus. Okay, now Venerable Nandaka is going to illustrate the point of the teaching using 2 similes. So first he gives a simile of an oil lamp that's burning. And now he says its oil is impermanent, subject to change. The wick is impermanent. The flame is impermanent. And the radiance is impermanent and subject to change. So now would anyone be speaking rightly who spoke thus? While this oil lamp is burning, its oil, wick, and flame are impermanent and subject to change, but its radiance is permanent, everlasting, eternal, not subject to change. And so then the nuns say, that's not so, Venerable Sir, because while the oil lamp is burning, its oil, wick, and flame are impermanent and subject to change. And so its radiance or its light must be impermanent and subject to change. Okay, then Nandaka draws the conclusion and he says, so would anybody be speaking rightly who said these 6 internal bases are impermanent and subject to change, but the pleasant, painful, or neither painful nor pleasant feeling that one experiences in dependence upon the 6 internal sense bases is permanent, everlasting, eternal, not subject to change? Okay, just to map out the simile. I have to admit, I'm a little bit confused by this simile. The reason is that it would seem to me, in the simile, we have 3 things: oil, wick, and flame. And yet these are being used as an illustration just for the internal sense bases. It would seem to me to make better sense if one takes, for example, the oil to represent the internal sense bases, or let's say the wick to represent the internal sense bases, since the wick is the stable part of the lamp. The oil to represent the external sense bases, because the oil is something that you pour. I don't know if you've ever used kerosene lamps, but we used to use them all the time in Sri Lanka. So generally the wick is fairly stable. You have to change it once a month or so. But you always have to put every day or every other day, you have to put new kerosene into the lamp. And so we can take the oil to be the external sense bases, because whereas the sense faculties at least seem to be fairly stable, but the objects are always changing. I look around the room and different colors, different shapes, but the eye seems to be fairly stable. Then the flame is what arises based upon the oil and the wick. That would seem to represent consciousness. I don't think so. Yeah. No, I don't think so. Because yeah, but I think it's speaking about a lamp which is already burning. So it's taking for granted that the lamp has been lit. Yeah, so the flame is, well, you know what a flame is. It's that part which is shaped something like this, red, yellow, orange in color. Then the light is what's distributed through the flame. So it makes better sense to me, instead of taking the whole simile just to represent the internal sense bases, to take each element of the simile to represent one to represent the internal sense bases, another to represent the external sense bases, the flame to represent consciousness, because consciousness in a way is like a flame, which it's, in a sense, burning, always sending out the light of awareness. And then the light itself is here being compared to the feeling. But feeling arises always in the Buddhist exposition in dependence upon contact. So there's one element which is missing in the simile. If we take light, okay, so we take oil to represent the external sense bases, the wick, internal sense bases. Okay, then it seems to me that the simile makes better sense. But then one element is missing from this alignment of factors. What is missing? No. We have sense bases, internal, external, consciousness, feeling. I heard it's coming from someplace here. You said it. Yeah, right. It's contact. So there has to be in order for feeling to arise, there has to be the contact, which is the coming together of internal sense bases, external sense bases, and consciousness. Actually, maybe if we let consciousness as the flame be in the sense that you represented as the match, then contact will be the flame that flares up from the match. I know you could work out the simile as... Contact is the condition for feeling. Contact presupposes consciousness, because contact is the coming together of consciousness with the object through the sense faculty. Okay, now all of these, according to the perspective of the Buddha's teaching, are impermanent. And so this is, in a way, this is the way, it's not brought out explicitly here, but this is the way in which the Buddha, through the sort of strategy of his teaching, seeks to break the driving role of craving. So craving is the force which drives the cycle of birth and death. And craving is the origin of dukkha. And the condition for craving is feeling. And one latches onto feeling in the assumption or presupposition that the feeling is permanent. Even though one can't believe this conceptually, but there's a kind of unconscious presupposition that I'll go on enjoying the feelings that are pleasant and enjoyable. And so by exposing the impermanence of feeling, when one comes to recognize the impermanence of feeling, then craving is without any object to latch onto. Because one sees even pleasant feeling, which is the primary motivation of craving, even that pleasant feeling is impermanent. And so when one sees into the impermanence of pleasant feeling, then craving will be overthrown or turned around. And so this impermanence of contact, it's not mentioned explicitly in the sutta, but in the paragraph that begins where the nuns say, well, Nandaka asked the nuns whether when the six internal bases are impermanent and subject to change, whether the pleasant, painful, or neutral feeling that one experiences in dependence upon the six internal bases can be permanent, everlasting, eternal, not subject to change. Then the nuns say, not so, Venerable Sir, because each feeling arises in dependence upon its corresponding condition, and with the cessation of its corresponding condition, the feeling ceases. And that condition upon which the feeling arises, in each case, it's contact. And contact is the coming together of external sense base, internal sense base, in consciousness. And so they are all impermanent, always changing. And so the contact that arises through them has to be impermanent, always changing. Okay, now we come to the second simile that Nandaka uses. And as we'll see, he's going to apply this to the external sense bases, but it makes better sense to me if we take each part of the simile, just as we did with the simile of the oil lamp, and apply each part to a different element in this process of perception. Okay, so here we have a great tree standing possessed of heartwood. So its root is impermanent and subject to change. Its trunk is impermanent, subject to change. The branches are impermanent and subject to change. And its shadow is impermanent and subject to change. Okay, now could anyone say that the root, trunk, branches, and foliage of this great tree standing possessed of heartwood are impermanent and subject to change, but its shadow is permanent, everlasting, eternal, not subject to change? Then the answer is no. And why so? Because the root, trunk, branches, foliage of the great tree are impermanent and subject to change, so its shadow must be impermanent and subject to change. So here we could do it. Yeah, the branches and foliage actually go together. They form a compound. Yeah, in this simile, it's rather hard to distinguish which should be the internal sense bases, which should be the external sense bases. But let's arbitrarily say that the root are the internal sense bases. Because the sense faculties seem to be fairly stable, just like the root of the tree. But whereas the trunk grows out from the root, the external sense bases, forms, sounds, and so on, don't grow out from the sense organs, but they have their own independent existence. Okay, then the branches and foliage, we could say, represent consciousness, which grows out from the interaction of internal and external sense bases. And then we have the shadow representing the feeling. And again, the nuns say that the external sense bases are impermanent and subject to change. Well, it's actually Nandaka says this, that because the 6 external sense bases are impermanent and subject to change, the pleasant, painful, or neutral feeling that one experiences depending upon the 6 external bases cannot be permanent, everlasting, eternal, not subject to change. So the point is that all the feeling that arises through the external sense bases will be impermanent. And that's because each feeling arises in dependence upon its corresponding condition. Again, it arises in dependence on a particular contact. And with the cessation of its corresponding condition, the feeling ceases. And it seems that this principle can be understood at different levels of subtlety. For example, you might say that if I'm looking at a red object, that in this case, the form is lasting for some period of time, that the eye is lasting for some period of time, and that visual consciousness is lasting for some period of time, and therefore that as long as I'm looking at the red object, the contact that's experiencing the redness is persisting through that time. If I'm looking at a red object for 3 minutes, it seems that during that time, the contact and the feeling arising from that contact will be stable and lasting. But actually, according to the way of developing through the development of mindful attention to one's experience, one starts to see at subtler and subtler levels how let's say at subtler and subtler levels with increasing frequency, the contact is taking place, the consciousness is arising, the contact is taking place, and the feeling is arising and passing away. And so as one goes on attending to a particular sense object, or say a sensation, that sensation will start breaking up within one's awareness into units of sensation. Units of sensation which are succeeding each other with extreme